Okay. Well, welcome everybody. My name is Miggy Torres, and I'm excited to present to you a little piece of mine called Autopoietic Bloom. I have a secret to admit. I live a bit of a double life, as seen here. Most of you know me as this guy, the person who's probably set up many of your MacBooks or something, or the person who you call when you can't get your email to work. But the last 12 years of my life, I've spent doing something closer to this, which is composition and interdisciplinary art. You'll note that, just a disclaimer here, I had some Adobe fonts in this presentation that didn't come along for the ride. So you might see some wonky things like that weird white space between the artist and the frame. I promise I am an artist. If you're curious, if it matters, these are my credentials. I did my master's degree here and studied a little bit at IRCOM. If someone were to tell me what kind of music do you write, I would probably say I don't know. But this is the best I can tell you, is that it's an experimental style that often transcends various media, including film, music, theater, interactive media, and performance art, with the ultimate goal of immersing folks in parallel realities, fluorescent mythologies, and transformative aesthetic experiences. So just a little overview here for today, for today's talk. First, I want to give you a quick background on Amatria in case anyone here is unfamiliar with Amatria. I know there's some folks from Miles Brand who very rarely set foot on the 4th floor, so figured I'd give you just a summary of that. Quick summary of Autopoietic Bloom. Then I want to talk a little bit about my approach to art and design, and then we'll dive a little more deeply into those ideas vis-a-vis Autopoietic Bloom, and then we'll finish up with some technical details, a demonstration of the software, and a discussion about the preliminary community impact of the work. So this is Amatria. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it already. Amatria is a so-called sentient sculpture that hangs from the 4th floor of Luddy Hall. It was designed by Living Architecture Systems Group, which is this wonderful studio in Ontario, Canada, led by Philip Beasley. It's currently under the care of the Cyber Infrastructure Network Science Center, which is led by Dr. Kati Borner. It's essentially these fractured spheres with a polymer mesh canopy that's equipped with sensors and actuators that enwreathe visitors and the surrounding architecture. And it has little plastic fronds and lights and sounds and things. Hello, welcome. And it can sort of respond dynamically to its environment. So Autopoietic Bloom, what is Autopoietic Bloom? Autopoietic Bloom is a mood-based gestural improvisation engine for multi-channel living architecture systems. So it's a suite of around 24 improvisational schemes and then custom software for the real-time interpretation and performance of those schemes by compatible living architecture, in this case, Amatria. So with Autopoietic Bloom, Amatria can compose and perform a musical work that is unique every single time. Each improvisation is a non-repeatable event, an expression of uniqueness of identity, and an opportunity for human connection, so that people are kind of joined, they're bound by this unique aesthetic experience that they're all sharing that will never happen again. And this, you may have passed this on the 4th floor. This little tablet is one of the interfaces for Autopoietic Bloom, and we'll see this again before the end of the talk today. So in preparing for this talk, I was really concerned with gearing this toward the design folks, the HCI people. And so I began to think a lot about design and how the work that I do is kind of related to design, it intersects with design. How are design and the arts related? Are they different things? Are they the same thing? And very soon I realized that this was a question that people who have been alive a lot longer than I have been wrestling with for decades. You know, some people think it's art design. Some people think 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 art design. I'm particularly, I kind of like this, except I would probably say it's something closer to art design, because the boundaries of what we do so often are very blurred. So anyway, in thinking about art and design, I realized, you know, we can sit around and try to pontificate about our ideologies, but really the most important the most important thing, a definition is only important insofar as it's useful to us. And so what is a useful definition of this relationship? And for me, a useful definition is that design or art is a process by which we reinvent reality. That seems pretty deep, seems like a pretty deep words, but I want to dive into this a little more because I think it'll give you an understanding of my approach. And so I want to just talk a little bit about the phenomenology of reality. And to do this, we're going to have to leave the realm of informatics and computing, leave the realm of music and arts, and even leave the realm of design, and find ourselves in the middle of the world of religious anthropology. And I promise you this will make sense in a moment. So Clifford Geertz, who was an anthropologist, defined, he created a very useful definition for what a religion is. So according to Geertz, a religion is a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations in people by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. So by this definition, it's a very broad definition. We can classify all sorts of things using this definition. Familiar belief systems, for example, such as Abrahamic religions, things like that, religions that are maybe less recognizable or maybe on the edges of what we would consider a religion versus a philosophy, non-theistic forms of Buddhism, that should be a U, not an I, and things like Confucianism, etc., things that are more concerned with social order and things like that. And then we might even be able to classify social constructs that exist as religions in disguise, like consumerism and personality cults. So suddenly we realize that this definition can be abstracted to encompass not only religions, but foundational systems of experiencing the world. That is to say, we experience the world symbolically. Our basic worldviews are simply dense, deeply interconnected systems of symbols that together generate meaning. That is, for something to have meaning, for someone, it has to be coded in the mind as a symbol. And then these symbolic webs can be spun in a variety of ways. But one particularly interesting way and very useful way of spinning these webs is through myth. So the expert on myth that I'm going to be invoking right now is Mircea Eliade, who was a Romanian anthropologist. For Eliade, myths establish symbols that signify the way the world works on a primordial and authoritative level. The symbols in a myth are prototypical. Myths give us examples of some original event which generates symbols that define a community's relationship with reality. And while I was building this graph, I actually noticed, doesn't this look kind of like a transistor to you? I don't know, that kind of looks like a transistor to me, which I don't know what to make of that, but just something to think about. Anyway, these symbols are intersections of the so-called divine world with into the profane world. And here, when I say divine, I think I'd rather use the word sacred, because sacred doesn't just necessarily mean something religious. We've left the world of religious anthropology. Now it's just a metaphor, right? Sacred, a symbol is sacred is something that specifies how the world ought to be, how it ought not to be, what things have value, and even sometimes what things even exist. And that can be contrasted with the term profane. Here we don't mean profane like a bad word. We mean profane in the sense that profanum in Latin means in front of the temple, so something that is non-religious, that is not sacred. So Eliade termed these manifestations of the divine into, or of the sacred into the profane world, hierophanies. And according to him, everything that someone experiences only holds value insofar as it relates to these original symbols. When someone takes part in a ritual that reenacts mythical events, they are re-invoking the original event and regenerating all of the symbols that it produces, effectively updating the symbolic firmware of their lives. Moreover, just as leaving a busy street corner, and entering a cathedral transposes one from profane space into sacred space, Eliade believed that participation in a ritual can transpose one from profane time into sacred time. And not just any sacred time, but the sacred time, the original sacred time when the hierophanies that underpin our realities first exploded into being. So In a religious context, these rituals are often reenactments of myths in that religion, but in a secular environment, these things can be anything. It can be myth, reenactment, storytelling, theater, dance, sports, etc., etc., etc. These are all symbols of the sacred that arrive from new, perhaps alien realities against which, whew, I'm getting emotional, I love this, whew, against which they can measure them. People can measure themselves, their values, and the way they understand the world around them. You can tell I really believe in it because it's, whew, it's great. So anyway, that was a lot. Let's summarize this because I word vomited at you and I almost broke out in tears just now. So let's summarize this. Number one, perceptions of reality are generated in the mind by an interwoven web of symbols. Number two, these symbols give meaning to everything we experience. That is, for something to have meaning to someone, it must be coded in the mind as a symbol. Some of you may be familiar with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which says a similar thing, except strictly sort of linguistically, but this is kind of extrapolating that outside of a linguistic context. These symbols can be generated by myth, windows into new realities that describe how things ought to be, how things ought not to be, what things have value, and what things even exist. All of art is myth abstracted. A work of art is a window into new reality with its own system of symbols. When the reality of a work of art collides with the reality of one's everyday life, the two symbolic webs intersect and interact, giving way to new truths and new perceptions of reality. And so this, in essence, is how I believe art functions. So when I think about the difference between art and design, and I think about things like aesthetics versus function, I think a lot about how this is the function of a work of art. So in many ways, when you're creating a work of art, you're designing a system, but instead of it being a mechanical system or an electrical system, it's a symbolic system. It's a system of symbols that will intersect and interact with the observer's native symbolic system in their brains to encourage a particular aesthetic experience. And of course, here you can replace the word observer with user, the word aesthetic experience with UX, and it quickly becomes relevant. So that's sort of an overview of my approach, and I'm hoping that that will help to contextualize the rest of this work moving forward. So now, speaking of which, let's talk about Autopoietic Bloom, the reason why we are here in the first place. I used as a point of departure a lot of the questions that Living Architecture Systems Group was exploring when they began to work on Amatria, the sculpture itself. So these are some questions that they asked. Can architecture integrate living functions? Can future buildings think or care? How do humans respond to these evolving interactions in a process of mutual adaptation? And then I took this in my own direction. I asked things like, can living architecture help people to create social or parasocial relationships with their environment? What would be the nature of those relationships? How can living architecture mediate social relationships among people? What role does sound play in that mediation? And then how can people connect with each other through a shared sonic environment? So I came up with a few desiderata for the piece. So number one was create a musical experience that allows people to deepen their relationship with the architecture of Luddy Hall and with each other as mediated through their relationship with Amatria. Number two is create a musical experience that deepens the sense that Amatria is alive. Number three is to situate the observer and the sculpture in the same so-called sacred time and place, which is related to what we discussed earlier. And then number 4 and 5 are pretty self-explanatory. Something that has life beyond a single performance, and then something that respects and preserves Amatria's own artistic identity and the original sound design that came with it. So going one by one here, time and space as a mediator of human relationships. Does anyone recognize this? Do you recognize this? Did you live there? Amazing. I used to take walks all around here as an undergrad. I went to school across the street from this place. This, for those who don't know, this is Cornell University, and this is a little place called The Slope on Cornell University. And my undergrad was Ithaca College, which was on the other hill. So one day I did not take this picture, but one day I was walking in this area, and as you can probably see, at least kind of, the sunsets in Ithaca are pretty amazing. I mean, they're really, really nice. So I was walking one evening around the Cornell campus, and I noticed the sun was setting, and it was really beautiful. So I decided I was going to stop and just watch the sun go down. And after a few minutes, I noticed someone else who was walking had stopped next to me and was watching the sun. And then another minute went by, and another person stopped. And after a couple more minutes, there was maybe half a dozen people all gathered there, stopped to watch the sun go down. And the sun finally went down over the hills as we see it here, and we all just quietly dispersed. And it was this really beautiful moment where we could all come together and experience this beautiful experience that connected us. We didn't know each other. I don't know who those people were. I don't know their names. I didn't say anything to them, but we are kind of metaphysically bound through that experience. So that served as a lot of inspiration for this piece here. Moving on to the next one, biomimesis through music. So biomimesis, right? It's the idea that you're acting as though you're alive. So this was inspired, the work that I was trying to, the biomimetic aspects of Autopoietic Bloom were inspired by Amatria's behavior engine. So the behavior engine is all the stuff that makes all the lights and the actuators move. And so the way the behavior engine works, basically you can influence certain behaviors, but you can't explicitly control them. You can't really say, turn on this light right now. You can say, here's a sine wave, and when the crest of the sine wave reaches that light, maybe it'll turn on, maybe it won't. Things like that. So it can be parametrically specified at a very high level. And then I also was really concerned with personifying Amatria. I wanted to bring, I wanted people to connect with it like a living thing. And so I wanted to give Amatria agency from a musical point of view. I wanted to make Amatria the musician. I didn't want Amatria to just be a bunch of speakers where I push play and it does the same thing every time and there's no agency there. And so in centering Amatria as the composer, the idea here is that the ability to create implies life, and the ability to make choices about what you're creating implies life even more strongly. And so that's where the title of the piece comes from, autopoiesis. Autopoiesis is a term that you may have heard if you are involved in cognitive science or complex systems theory. It comes from the Greek auto and poiesis. Auto means self and poiesis means creation. And all it is, it's a fancy $2 word for for the ability of a system to reproduce and maintain itself by creating its own components using its own components. And so the metaphor here, so Amatria or Autopoietic Bloom isn't a literal autopoietic system, unfortunately, but the metaphor is that as Amatria gives life to music, music gives life to Amatria. And then let's see. So the number 3, I don't remember what my next slide is. What's my next slide? Is it technical stuff? Yeah, okay, hold on. Number 3, situate the observer in the same time and place. Remember that example I gave about the cathedral, about you're still going on the street and then suddenly you're going from this like mundane worldly space and you've entered this sacred space where there's new symbols telling you what's real and what's important. Another example is like a nightclub. You go from like the street into the nightclub. If anyone's ever been to the root cellar on a busy night, right outside, it's all fine, but then there's this like heavy door, and when you open the heavy door, there's this burst of noise, and then you enter, and you're like you're in another planet or something, right? And so that's the idea. Except in this case, what I really wanted to do was like kind of turn that inside out. I wanted to take all of the, I wanted to have the cathedral kind of spill out into the street. And so I wanted to kind of blur that boundary of where does that sacred time and space begin and end. So we'll talk more about that as we talk more about the technical details. So some considerations for the software architecture of this piece. With all of that conceptual stuff in mind, I knew that I wanted it to be able to think like a composer or like a musician. So the ways of processing data needed to be musical. It couldn't just be purely mathematical or from a computational point of view. It really needed to start with how would a musician think about this stuff. And I knew that there would need to be a minimum number of modules that would need to be in place for this to work. It also needed to be flexible and extensible so it could integrate with Amatria's other functions. And also, integrate with any future interfaces or any future functions that the sculpture may have. Let's talk about music from mood and parametric composition. So all the improvisations are predefined parametrically at a musically, quote unquote, high level. The musical parameters for each improvisation are selected in response to local weather patterns. And actually, this should be, I don't know why I made this such a small line here. This should really be its own slide, because this is really, when we talk about human-computer interaction, this is really the crux of how, basically, how can Amatria detect mood in a community without gathering biometric data, right? Because doesn't that seem gross? If, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, imagine I came up to you every day and said, hey, how are you feeling? Are you depressed? What's your blood pressure? You know, like, wouldn't you feel like, get out of my face? Like, leave me alone. Like, get out of here. And so, especially these days, you know, the specter of Big Brother still hangs thick in our zeitgeist, and even more so now with, you know, with when we think about data harvesting and data privacy. So I knew I didn't want to have any sort of sense of collecting biometric data, but then how do you go about, you know, measuring the overall mood of a group of people? And so it struck me that the weather would be a really nice proxy for this, for several reasons. Number one, weather patterns tend to change a lot. And so that would sort of provide a certain kind of randomness to aid in that biomimetic quality. But also our moods are very closely tied to weather, even though it might seem banal, something we don't think about at all. Our moods, you know, when it's sunny out, if it's nice out, I'm like, okay, let's go, let's party. And if it's raining, maybe I'm feeling more introspective or something. So the idea here is that Amatria is able to detect weather data and then use that to synthesize a musical response. Yes, as I just said. Lovely. So the parameters can be defined by you or me, but only Amatria can actually produce the music, in the sense that she's choosing on a very granular level the rhythms and notes and transformations and things. So let's talk about the software components of this piece here. So some of these are pretty sort of boring. So the activation manager just turns it on and off. The weather data retrieval system is exactly that. There's a library of improvisational schemes, which we'll talk about later. The meat and potatoes of this is really the improvisation engine. And the improvisation engine has 4 parts, which I've given colloquial names to. Donatoni, the note generator, Syrinx, the multi-channel synthesizer, Quincy, the dynamic mixer, and Zoe, which is the interpolation engine. There's also an ambisonic spatializer, which lets us experience basically like a simulated version of the piece in this room, instead of having to be in front of the sculpture. So when we do the demonstration in a few minutes, you'll be experiencing it through the ambisonic spatializer. And there's also a visualizer called Mood Oracle, which I also created, that shows which speakers each of the voices is coming out of, basically. So the whole thing was coded and built in Max MSP. If you're not familiar with Max MSP, it's software that is used a lot in the artistic community for creating multimedia. It's like a graphical, you know, I'm sure you've seen these sorts of things before. They're like, you know, they're boxes with nodes and you attach them to things. It's not very text-based. There's some aspects of it that are, and for this piece especially, there's some things I needed to do in JavaScript and a few other languages, but most of it was by connecting little boxes and things. And it uses the Bach, Cage, and SPAT5 libraries. Bach and Cage, I'm going to talk about this in a moment, but the Bach and Cage libraries are all about representing musical information. And then the SPAT5 library is what I used for the ambisonic spatializer. So SPAT5 was designed by the folks at EarCom. And I think my pointer may have stopped working. So we'll just do, okay, maybe I think I just wasn't on PowerPoint. So here's a graphic of the basic idea of how this thing is put together. Looks complicated, I guess. I don't know. We can follow the kind of flow of information together. So we start here at the activation module, and then that tells the data processing unit to retrieve the weather data. After which it'll choose an improvisational scheme from the song library and load it into our loaded improvisational scheme. It'll also kind of turn on all the other stuff. At which point, Zoe, which is the breakpoint interpolator, which we'll talk about in a moment, will read all those values and distribute them across the system. And then all of that goes through Donatoni, through Syrinx, through Quincy, and out through the spatializer and into our ears. So we'll talk about these 4 components because, like I said before, they really are the meat and potatoes of the piece. We will start with Donatoni. Donatoni is named after a composer named Franco Donatoni, who if you know anything about his music, you will, when you listen to Autopoietic Bloom, you will you will probably hear the comparison. But he did a lot of stuff with musical gesture, and gestures that are non-repeating. So the note generator creates the music and creates and synthesizes and transforms all the musical data. So it makes heavy use of the Bach library for Macs, which is this really wonderful set of tools developed by Andrea Agostini and Daniele Ghisi for basically representing musical data in terms of linked Lisp-like linked lists. Wow. And which are essentially just nested arrays. So it's an array inside of an array inside of an array. So you might sort of begin to realize how musical data would be, how that's very conducive to representing musical data, because musical data is very hierarchical, right? You have a note and then a chord and then a measure and then a system and then a voice. It's all extremely hierarchical. So we can represent these structures as nested arrays and then transform them algorithmically. So it manipulates all of these lists and then sends 4 voices, move this over a little bit, sends 4 voice MIDI data to Syrinx. So right now it's just notes information. There's no sound yet. And why 4 voices? Well, I don't know. It worked for the Beatles. It's good enough for me. We don't need 10 voices, right? I mean, theoretically, you could do 16 because there's 16 MIDI channels, but you don't need that many. I mean, they would just get in the way. So I think 4 is perfectly fine. Let's see. I have to go back to PowerPoint. There we go. So Syrinx, a Syrinx is the organ inside of some birds that allows them to produce more than one note at a time when they sing. So that's the metaphor here. This is 4 parametrically controlled synths, 1 for each Donatoni voice. Each voice can support up to 4 simultaneous control signals to shape sounds dynamically. And this leverages Absinthe 5 by Native Instruments. When I finished building Donatoni, I was thinking, okay, now I'll build the synthesizer. And then I realized, you know what, Miggy, maybe you deserve a break. Maybe, maybe building an improvisation engine, maybe that's good enough. You can just use a plugin for this. And I did. And so I think this actually worked out really well because the way Absinthe 5 works, you can essentially just load a preset. So when you're telling it to change instruments, you don't need to worry about, you know, what's your FM modulation frequency. You just load a preset. Very easy. And then finally, Quincy, named after Quincy Jones, the world's greatest music producer, distributes signals from Syrinx's 4 voices to Amatria's 10 channels. And it does so over the course of the song, which is surprisingly non-trivial. I thought it would be an easy thing to do, and it turns out it's actually not as easy as it looks. But it can do this improvisationally as well, or algorithmically, or in tempo, etc. And this uses similar algorithms as Donatoni to manipulate all that stuff and to send all the data into the speakers at real time. Good. So with these 3 components, we have something close to sophisticated wind chimes. Right? We have something that can do something for a certain amount of time and then it stops, which is cool. But wouldn't it be cooler if it had like musical direction? You know what I mean? Wouldn't it be cool if you could turn a wind chime into a true musical aesthetic experience? If you could turn soundscape into narrative, what Eric Satie might call furniture music into concert music. Nothing wrong with Satie, love Satie. Speaking into aria, etc., or into singing recitative into aria. So what we need for this is an overarching formal organization that can supply a sense of transformation over the course of the piece. And so enter Zoe, the interpolation engine. Zoe is the Greek word for life. That's where that comes from. So Zoe imbues each song with artistic intent. So you have a sense of dramatic trajectory or transformation or metamorphosis or autopoiesis. With Zoe, you essentially get this giant breakpoint interpolator where all the parameters up to 235 per breakpoint can be interpolated over the length of the composition. So you can imagine that an improvisational scheme, they're written in JSON, but you can imagine if you could see in 235 dimensional space that it would essentially be like a sculpture in 235 dimensional space. Granted, not all of those dimensions are used for every song, but it's certainly possible. So through Autopoietic Bloom, the Zoe module, through Autopoietic Bloom's Zoe module, Amatria can improvise music that has climaxes and beginnings and middles and ends and narratives and accelerandi, etc. So it actually sounds like Amatria has a sense of artistic intent, where it's not just here's a bunch of sounds I'm making, and then I stop. And the possible points between which we can interpolate are virtually endless, although presumably, realistically, right, like you could compose a very strict improvisational scheme for it, and it could play very strictly. That would sort of defeat the purpose. So you can tell it to you can go note by note if you want. The software allows for that, but why would you want to? That seems to defeat the point of having it improvise. You can use virtually any number of breakpoints, but I think in this case, having as few as possible really works really well. Great. What's my next slide? A demonstration. Oh my God, this is great. Okay, let's do this. Let me, I have it on this computer, so give me a second while I figure out the technical side of this. And stop share. Screen share this, share sound. Oh, hold on, turn off my mic. I'm going to mute this again. So I should have actually I should have primed you for this, but actually in some ways I'm glad I didn't, because maybe let's see, where's Zoom? There's Zoom. I'm gonna just put this back on the screen. Mood Oracle here. So. Okay. So you get what this looks like. I didn't explain this, but this should be pretty self-explanatory. This is the staircase up to the 4th floor. This here is where you would be standing virtually, and then that's Amatria. And then each of the voices is, you know, color coordinated to the different speakers. That piece that you just heard, that improvisational scheme, is the improvisational scheme that is associated with rainfall. And I chose that one to share with you, partly because, hold on, I gotta do desktop first. Partly because I think it shows that the musical processes very clearly. You start out with these very simple ideas that get repeated over and over. So you're like, okay, here's the idea, get it, and then it changes and then it goes crazy. And so my hope is that that can sort of showcase the processes really well. Before I take questions, I do want to talk really quickly about the preliminary community impact that that this piece has had, which I'm very pleased with. So the first thing is that I took this on the road this summer to a festival called Nifnor Festival, which is a new music festival. And it was a blast. We had a couple of people who decided to do some improvisation with the machine, which I thought was really cool, like on their own instruments. They played piano or whatever it was. And so that was a really cool thing. More importantly, I want to revisit this idea that I talked about at the beginning of the talk today about the shared aesthetic experience. There was a moment in, I think it would have been like May of this year. So this piece was premiered in, I think, April, I think. So a month later, I wanted to show one of my friends the piece. And so I brought them up to the 4th floor and I turned it on, and we were just standing there listening to the music, and slowly but surely people started to peek their heads out of the focus rooms, and they all, you know, after about a minute or two, they all started crowding around the sculpture. And then when the music ended, they all went back. And I was extremely pleased that it had the intended effect of bringing people together through a shared aesthetic experience. So that was a very validating and rewarding experience to see that happen. Let's see, I think, is that concluding remarks? My presentation is telling me to wrap it up. So I want to thank a bunch of people. This project would not have been possible without obviously the folks who built Amatria, Philip Beasley, but also Matt Gorbet, Rob Gorbet, and Michael Lancaster, who really helped me to understand the sculpture when I was first getting to know it and getting to understand its systems. Big thanks to Katu Berner and Andreas Böckler here at CNS, along with Dave Cooley, Steve Cox, and the Luddy ITG. Big thanks to John Gibson, Felipe Tovaranau, and Mike Winters, who are other colleagues of mine and mentors of mine. The Bach project, of course, amazing piece of software. If you use Macs, I recommend you check out Bach. It's really cool. Cycling 74 is the people who built Macs. Sam Tarakajian is the guy who taught me how to use Macs. And of course, the folks over at Earcom who developed SPAT, which is this incredible audio spatialization software. Is that it? I think it's question time. Yeah, great. You know, it's so funny. I timed this out at home yesterday, and I was like, okay, I think I can make it under an hour. And then when I get in front of you guys, the adrenaline's running, and man, I just talk fast. I talk really fast. So we have a microphone here. Do we? Yes, we have one here in case there are any questions. Are there any questions? Yeah. Can you what? Sorry.
Can we do like demonstration of today's weather, like how the thing would read?
I don't have it connected right now, that part of it. I basically just have this only one for demonstration purposes, but I can send you a recording when it's, yeah, if you want.
Yes,
Yeah.
please.
I mean, I can check what the weather is. Let's see, without looking out the window. Local weather data.
The weather is not nice.
It's not nice. let's see. The weather is okay. I don't know. Yeah, I think it's not. It doesn't like this network, our network. So there's some things. There's still some bugs. Still some bugs. But I think what it's like partly cloudy or something. So yeah. Any other questions? Yes, the microphone is right there, so we can. Yeah.
First of all, the performance was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, and I was sort of thinking if this experience could maybe translate to VR or like some that kind of technology, or would that sort of detract from the experience? What do you think?
Good question. Yeah. There are a few things that ran through my mind when I was first thinking about this project. Specifically, like if I wanted to incorporate VR or AR or deep learning, that's another thing that's really been in our zeitgeist recently. It would be really cool to do that. The only problem that I have with VR, it's not a huge problem, but it's for me, it's significant, is that it can sometimes be a very solipsistic experience. It's just, you're in the goggles, and when other people are, you're experiencing it, but people look at you and they just see you in the goggles, right? And sometimes we do a thing where, okay, there's a screen that shows other people what you're seeing, but you're not really a part of it. And so if there were a way of having that experience that was where people could share it more easily, that would be, I think, would be really, really cool. With AR, it's a similar thing. I mean, I play Pokemon Go like anyone. And, I can show my friend, look, the Squirtle is on the stairs, but it's such a small screen, right? And so to share it, it can be very difficult. So iPads maybe work a little bit better. But I don't know. I mean, I think as that technology advances and we find more ways of implementing it, I think it could really work. I think the hardest thing about VR is the seeing. It's really, really easy to trick your ears. Your ears are stupid. You just get a binaural recording and it sounds like you're there. As far as your ears are concerned, you are transported to a different time and place. But your eyes, your eyes are hard. You have peripheral vision. You have the ability to focus on things close to you and far away from you. Like, how do you do that with a screen that's right in front of you? So, there's some ideas I have about that. But as far as I know, I haven't done a literature review on the topic, but as far as I know, those are the limitations. So, yeah. Yes. Cool. Hit me with them.
So first, how many man hours did this take you? And did you have any people help you? Or did you code it all yourself?
Yeah. Well, man hours, I don't know. I started working on it I started thinking about it. I got involved with Amatria in the spring of 2021, and the piece premiered in the spring of 2022. So it took about a year. I didn't work on it every day, but it did take quite a long time. I would guess 100, 200 hours or something like that. Yeah. And then to answer your second question, I basically coded it myself. Yeah, I had help with there were moments where I was like, oh my God, it's not working. Why isn't it working? Then I reached out to some mentors of mine and some folks who are more familiar with Macs and some of the more low level stuff. Because with this kind of thing, there's a lot that you have to there's a lot you have to worry about regarding timing of events. If one event doesn't happen before another one, it's not going to work. If you don't load the improvisational scheme before you push play, it's not going to work. And so there were a lot of questions about okay, which queue do I send this, which thread am I sending this information to, and all this sort of low level stuff that until now I hadn't really explored. So it was definitely a learning experience, but a fun one. And yeah, I don't know, in the art, one of the things, going back to differences between art and design, I think with artists, there's this weird idea that we have this idea of the romantic, the isolated genius where you have to do everything yourself. And I think that maybe a little part of me that was sort of has been training in that European tradition kind of had that idea that, I should do it all myself. Realistically, you don't have to. You can do it with friends and collaborate. So yeah.
And then my other question is, what's your favorite project besides this?
Besides this, that I've done? I think good question. It's whatever I'm working on at the moment. I would say earlier pieces. I wrote a violin concerto called "Wake Up, Gracie" that was really cool. Yeah, I really like it. I guess. Oh, you know what? You know what's my favorite one is I have a piece called "On the Fractured Identity of the Millennial" for 8 amplified voices, and it's about like vaporwave and the American dream and stuff like that.
That's over my head.
Cool.
Well, I don't have any other questions, but that was really cool. So thank you.
Thanks. I think we have some questions back there. We can move the microphone.
Thank you, Miggy. This is amazing.
Thanks.
So I have a question. So I really like when you say that when you create this piece that you really want the material to be the author of it, that it has its agency. I'm wondering, like, from your roles, you come with like the composer role, the engineer role, the designer role, and artist role. All of this role, you often bring in some sort of intention when you are creating these products, right? And oftentimes also like a lot of this role come with like kind of perfectionism, like this way you want to achieve it. But I think that sometimes it might be contradicting to kind of like what you just said, like I want to lose some of the control so that, the product can actually live on its own, can create on its own. How do you actually kind of navigate this like kind of seems contradictory kind of intentions?
That's a great question. It's very difficult because like I said, I mean, so my music, if you look at my scores, they're very, very specific. It's like, I want you to do this exact thing with that instrument at this particular time and not a millisecond later or before. And so one sort of philosophical challenge was to let go of some of that control here. By the same token, though, I mean, when we think about like folks like John Cage, who was a composer who famously embraced chance operations in composition of music. So for example, he would flip coins or roll dice to decide what the music is going to be. His goal was kind of to remove ego from the process. But I feel like there's always ego in the process, no matter what. Even if you're flipping coins, well, you decided to flip coins. How did you decide? Who told you to do that, right? And now, of course, when we say things like chance music or aleatoric music, first composer to pop to our minds tends to be John Cage. So I mean, he talk about ego. I mean, he's the king of all of that stuff. So I think what I cared about in the end was the phenomenology of it. Was how do you experience it as a listener? From the listener's point of view, is there enough variation where it sounds like the machine is doing the thinking? And so yeah, so I don't know if that sort of answers your question. You can turn all the random, you can turn the randomness up to 11. The way that you specify how random it is this subjective variable that I created called improvisational flux, which defines how chaotic is the improvisation, and then how often do things change. So how much does it, just like a waveform, what's the amplitude, what's the frequency? And that can be interpolated over the course of the piece. You can turn that up to 100% for the entire thing, and it just sounds like garbage. So there still needs to be some sort of mediation there between the composer and the machine, for there to be something that sounds good. But then again, at the same time, I mean, remember, like I just said, I love music that's really specific. I like that kind of mental virtuosity, the ability to hear something really specific and then write it down and then have that be played. That to me is something I really value a lot musically. And so to a certain extent, yeah, I can't escape, one can't escape one's own ego in that way. But the important thing I think for me was that the experience of listening to it gave people this idea that it's making its own decisions. And to a certain extent it is, but to another extent, they're guided, it's within decisions within a certain boundary. The reason why this cannot be considered a true autopoietic system has to do with how you define the boundary of that system. If there was a paper from the 1970s by Maturana and Varela, who basically were the people who pioneered the term autopoietic, that defined like 6 categories of, or a 6-step system for defining whether your system is autopoietic or not. And if you at every step change what you consider the boundary of the system, this is autopoietic. But that's cheating. You can't do that, right? You need to have the boundary be the same from the beginning to the end. So anyway, I forgot why I went off on that tangent. But in any case, yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yes, some questions over here.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, Miggy, that was amazing.
Thanks.
Absolutely loved it. So this is out of this. I guess I'm thinking about your influences as an artist,
Mhm.
and I'm curious which visual artists, musical artists, and how about artists working within technology and programming? Who are your greatest influences?
My greatest influences, well, musically, I don't know, I have a really broad, I like a lot of music. From a classical standpoint, I really like the work of George Ligeti. Donatoni, of course, Franco Donatoni is a really wonderful composer who, if you listen to his music, you'll see why the improvisation engine is called Donatoni. Who else? Kate Soper is a really great composer. I've been really into Caroline Polachek, who does amazing pop music. If you know the song "So Hot You're Hurting My Feelings," that's Caroline Polachek. Really great, really great. What else? From a visual point of view, I love the surrealists, and I like abstract expressionism. It's like really, I'm like all into that. I love, one of my favorite things we have here at IU are the Duchamp ready-mades. I freaking love those things. Oh my God, they're amazing. It's really just, you know, just case in point of how the boundaries of what we define as art is totally arbitrary. So I really like that. In terms of computing, I don't know if I have enough of a knowledge of computing to say who my sort of luminaries are, but I really like Michel van der Aa, he's a European artist who has this really cool opera called Upload. He does really cool things where he kind of uses technology to blur for the audience what is real and what is simulated. So for example, he just had this opera called Upload, which is all about uploading your consciousness into a computer. And he has on stage these big, like, transparent screens that they can project holograms onto. And the actor will act with the hologram, and then suddenly the hologram will like granulate into a million pieces. And then as far as the audience is concerned, they didn't even realize that was a hologram, and then suddenly it explodes, and it's this really dramatic thing. So I think that's really cool. I'm sure when I'm not in the hot seat, I'll have like a million other things pop into mind, but I really like jazz. Yeah, I don't know. A lot of jazz musicians are really good. So yes, any other questions?
Yeah,
Mhm.
thanks, Miggy. Now I at least know the story behind that 4th floor thing,
Yeah.
which I just called that thing. So just continuing the question Christina was asking in terms of like the freedom that you could give into the form, but at the same time have your boundaries. And I also see that was not just the audio or the, the sensory stuff of it, but there is also a physical form that piece has. So how did you balance the freedom around all the multi-sensory aspects of that entire piece?
Yeah, good question. Well, I like art that is very, when it comes to interdisciplinary art, I like art in which all of the different components integrate with each other very well. You can kind of contrast that with art that where the different components are kind of living in their own world and have this kind of overall, I don't know, I'll use a musical term, this like dissonance between them, which can be very powerful and very cool. But my philosophy tends to be more like, I want everything to come from the same creative impulse. So, so as far as all the other components, like the physical form of it and everything, I wanted to play into all of that, to make something that was native to that environment, as opposed to something that was from a different environment that then kind of just got installed in there. Yeah, like, so like, for example, the speakers, I had to measure this, like where the speakers were spatially to get the ambisonics to work properly. So, and then of course there's 10 channels because there are 10 speakers there. So in that sense, and the fact is the sculpture was designed before I created this. So I didn't get a lot of input in terms of the design of the sculpture itself. It was more like, here's what you're working with. Here are the creative restrictions that you need to deal with, and do whatever you want. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Does that answer your question, or?
Yeah, that's interesting. But I also wanted to see, was there any moment of frustration that, oh, this form could have been a little different for giving me the creative freedom in terms of the music that you could add to it?
In terms of the form of the sculpture, you mean?
Yeah.
I'm
I'm trying to get the dissonance pieces of the designer, probably, or the artist.
Yeah. I don't think so. I mean, I think I became familiar with the sculpture before I started working on this, or as I was beginning to work on this. So I used it as a point of departure. So those were all sort of like, here's what you have. And so I didn't really feel like I wanted to go against at least their design. That said, there have been issues with the sculpture from a technical standpoint, which have gotten in the way of having this being turned on all the time. You'll notice if you go upstairs, the sculpture is turned off, and it's because there's some technical problems, which are difficult to address because the sculpture is hanging over a 30-foot drop, and it's not safe to go up there and fiddle with things. So in that regard, in terms of like the practical, what the sculpture is from a practical point of view versus what the sculpture is theoretically, from a practical point of view, there are things I wish would be different. I wish that all the speakers would be working properly. I wish that that it had the most current version of its behavior engine loaded. I wish that those are the main things, I guess. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say. I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but is that?
No, any kind of the behind story, but then I just wanted to know what you thought was
Cool.
Thank you.
Sweet. Yeah. Yes. Hi.
Hi. Thank you. This was incredible.
Thanks.
So I love that it's woven through all of this is this kind of, you're honoring the illusion of the sentience and the autonomy. But if you take that away, you've kind of created something where a computer is making music in a very high level with all these parameters. It kind of reminds me of the rise of computer generated art that kind of is in the zeitgeist right now as well. So I was just wondering, what's your idea for the future of the software that you've written? Do you see it only in this kind of benevolent interactive design situation, or do you see it escaping into other uses, et cetera, et cetera?
Malevolent. Yeah, malevolent software. I only write malevolent music. Yeah, well, there are a lot of things that Autopoietic Bloom can't do that I think would be cool if it could in version 2.0. For example, the way that it works right now, it uses kind of an iterative algorithm where it takes a particular background gesture and it sends it through a whole bunch of transformations in series, and then it spits that out. So here's I can show you this one. So we have the gesture, the original gesture, and then it goes through all of these 11 different transformation functions, and then it spits it out. That's an iterative process. It always goes back to, every time it gets an impulse, it always goes back to the original gesture and sends it through again. What it doesn't do, it doesn't have a recursive algorithm. It can't listen to itself and then change based on what it just sang. And the way that humans improvise, we do both at the same time, right? You're always listening and you're playing. And so that would be really cool if it could have sort of a more recursive algorithm. Another thing that would be cool would be if it had an understanding of harmony. Right now it doesn't. And in the sense that the voices are solipsistic, in the sense that the first voice is doing, like it understands like modes. So like the first voice is doing like generic thirds in A major, and what we just heard. But the second voice doesn't know what chord is playing. So as a result, a lot of the music is very modal, but it doesn't have a sense of like harmony in the sense that like, first we're on this chord, then we're on this chord, and now we're on this chord. So that would be a cool thing. In terms of like AI, I don't know. When as I mentioned earlier, I was thinking about whether there would be a nice implementation for deep learning for this piece, and I decided no. I don't know if that's just because, I don't know. I mean, with any, so whenever you use in any kind of, going back to Christina's question, right? Like with deep learning, okay, what's your data set? And then what biases are reflected in that data set that are reflected in the data set because you're the composer, right? Do I just put a bunch of Bach in there? Do I put a bunch of Caroline Polachek in there? Do I put a bunch of Miles Davis in there? Like, what do I feed it? And so if it's all going to come from here in the first place, just cut out the middleman and do it myself. So that's the idea, at least that I have right now. But I think it is a really cool. I don't know. I think that it's extensible, which is a really cool part of it, which is that you can, if you wanted it to be 5 voices, you just copy one of the voices and send it to Quincy, or you just change the channel mixer matrix or whatever. If you needed it to be, you know, plugged into a different sculpture, it can be. So it's definitely something that could be redeployed in different contexts with a little bit of fiddling. But yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question? Great.
Thank you.
Yes.
Hi, this was so cool.
Thanks.
I got more of a technical question.
Uh-huh.
And if it's too much, then let me know. But you mentioned like breakpoint interpolation.
Mhm.
So what do you mean by that? And like, what is the temporal resolution of that?
What I mean is, this is the piece. This is 100% done of the piece. This is 0% done. You start here, you go here, you go here, you do this. These dots are the breakpoints, and it interpolates between them. So you create a graph, one for every parameter, and the resolution, offhand, I don't know, but it depends on how long the piece is, because you can stretch this across any arbitrary length. So this piece was like 5 minutes long, I think, that we heard, 5 or 6 minutes. And so it'll always just read a number. Zoe, the breakpoint, it'll read a number between 0 and 1. Or rather, the way it works on a more technical level, there's a clock, the global clock, the master clock. At the beginning of the piece, you tell it how long the piece is, and it'll take that amount of time to go from 0 to 1 floating point numbers. That information then gets sent to Zoe, which, based on what number it gets from the clock, it knows which breakpoint to load. So when it hits, say, 0.5, it looks in the JSON file and says, 0.5, okay, you do this now. So that's how it works. And so theoretically, because, you know, I mean, the resolution is limited by how many decimals you give it. And I think right now, I don't remember offhand if I've limited the number of decimals to 6 decimal places or less, but even I mean, 6 is a lot for music. I mean, that's what, 1/10 of a second or less. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. So Zoe is the thing that's determining like, okay, I will build these breakpoints based on like, I want an accelerando, I want a beginning, I want an end.
Sorry, can you say the end of that again? I couldn't hear you.
So like Zoe is what's building that breakpoint structure to create this like feeling of movement.
Basically, I mean, so the idea, Zoe is what is interpolating between everything.
Okay.
So so if we look at the JSON file, it'll say at 0, and then there'll be 234 or whatever it is numbers there. At 0.5, 234 numbers. And so the composer, say me, for example, will specify what happens at the beginning, what happens in the middle, and what happens at the end. But Zoe like connects everything into a single idea, musical idea, and is able to kind of interpolate between those ideas. There are obviously some things that can't interpolate between, right? Like if I want to go from a C major chord to a single note of B flat, how do you interpolate between that? You can't, right? So for those things, it's just a quick switch. But for things where you can interpolate, it does.
All right, that's super cool. Thank you.
Thanks. I think there was a question down here.
What's your initiatives you want to design the bloom shape, and then what kind of the failure you come across during this journey? Thank you.
Sorry, what was the first question?
The first one is, what's your initiatives when you decided to want to design the bloom shape?
The shape?
Yes, like the bloom shape.
Oh, you mean do you mean of the song or of the sculpture?
The sculpture.
The sculpture. So I didn't design the sculpture. That was designed with Luddy Hall when they made Luddy Hall by Living Architecture Systems Group, which is this Canadian architecture firm that does a lot of these wonderful sculptures. But I can tell you that what they're interested in is exploring this idea of sustainable architecture, or I should say living architecture is what they call it, but it really is about sustainability. And so when I was thinking about like those ideas that were embedded in the sculpture, I wanted something that would kind of, you know, explore the idea of like, what's the emotional sustainability of an environment? And so that was sort of how the sculpture inspired me to do all of this. So I don't know if that doesn't really answer your question or.
Yeah, it's answer my question. And the second question is that what kind of failure do you come across during this journey? Like you need to combine all of these things. You need to think about the environment. So what kind of failure you feel struggle during this?
Oh yeah. Well, I would say, good question. I mean, this was such an exploratory journey for me that it's hard to say whether there were any failures. There were, okay, so one of my original ideas was to have the activation. You can actually see it because this is an older graph. Here, it says human input here. And right now that's not really a thing. And my original idea was to have some kind of human input for this, where maybe you might have something like a button that's several buttons that are distributed across the building, and different people might be touching them at the same time. And if they are, the music plays. And so if you have something like 3 or more people touching an interface at any given time, the music might play. I thought that was a really cool idea because it's this idea of like connecting people through sound. And if you're touching a button on the 4th floor and someone's on the 1st floor touching the button between classes and the music plays, then you sort of have this feeling like you're not alone. But that proved to be just too ambitious. And there are also regulations about like what kinds of things we can put in the building and things like that. So there were, I don't know, I guess there were some more ambitious ideas I needed to like let go of. What else? There was a lot of debugging. There were a lot of moments where I push play and nothing happens. And I'm like, okay, now I have to figure out what's going on. And a lot of that, yeah, there was a lot of learning involved in terms of like sort of the low level programming stuff about timing. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but MaxMSP, which is the program that this is coded in, it has 2 main threads, a low priority thread and a high priority thread. The low priority thread is for things like graphics, things like, I don't know, JavaScript, things like that. And the high priority thread is for things that need to happen within a particular, like at the audio rate, like it needs to happen at this exact moment, otherwise it's going to sound bad. And so there were things that I had in one thread that needed to be in the other, and things I had in one that needed to be in the other one. And so, yeah, I would say the debugging process was fraught with a lot of initial failures that proved to be learning experiences, and that I hope are now I can hopefully consider them successes. Another thing that's also, it's been a little bit frustrating is just that the fact that the sculpture right now, at least, the audio systems for the sculpture are kind of unstable. And I wish that they were working a little bit better. My software works fine. No, it's just, it was a bunch of, I mean, with COVID, usually the folks from LASG would come down and service it. But with COVID, they haven't been able to do it, and then they haven't been able to do so since then. So it's a mix of things, but yes. Right.
The sculpture produces, or like the software produces, does it contain those songs? Because there's nothing going back into the library, but
Right.
there's something coming out of it. But you said that it creates its own music.
Correct. Yeah. So for those watching at home, the question was, basically like how unique are the songs in the song library, and does it actually create its own music, or is it constantly reading from the song library, since there's no data that goes back into the song library? And the answer is that the song library is a library of like high-level schemes that they can follow based on different situations. Those high-level schemes are always constant. What happens on a granular level, the way that you actually hear the notes and rhythms and things, that's different every time. But in terms of like the overall sound of a piece, if I push play again on this, it'll sound similar to what you heard last time, even though the notes and rhythms will be different. The overall sound will be the same. The same general things will be happening. So that's sort of going back to Christina's question, I guess, like, where do you draw the line between what creative programs you give to the sculpture versus what you keep for yourself? And that's where I kind of drew the line for me, was I will be able, as the composer, to sort of to specify high-level things like general, okay, it's going to start sounding kind of like this, and then when you get to this part of the song, start doing this, and then when you get to the end, do something else. But the music, but the granular music, the notes, the rhythms, the timbres, etc., are all chosen by Autopoietic Bloom.
So, like, what is the library composed of? Like, where is the music coming from?
Yeah,
Where
the
is
library is, do I have it? I can show you one. The library is a whole bunch of JSON files, which describe a song in terms of those breakpoints that I was describing. So let's see here. Actually, this will be really helpful, I think, because it'll show you something of my process. So let me share my screen real quick. Share screen. Oh, I have to unshare here first. I'll show you one of the files, and then I'll show you what I use to compose these things. So let's see, where are they? Is it under song data? This is an older version, so schemata. Okay, we'll use this one. This is the rainfall one here. We'll open this with, we'll just use whatever. We'll just use text edit, whatever. So, okay. This is your duration, right? 5 1/3 minutes. Then you have your breakpoints. Breakpoint 0, here's what's going on in Donatoni, voice 1, turned on, start playing, which channel, what are your pitches, what are your rhythms? And so this is all specifying stuff for the very beginning of the piece. And it isn't until we get to right here, I don't know if you can see this, 0.09375. I don't know how far in that, I think that's like 30 seconds into the piece or something like that. Then it's saying, okay, now this stuff is happening, right? This is all the general idea of what is happening. You can see we have some of these nested arrays I was describing before. Here's one over here. And so it keeps doing that until we get to the very end, which if we scroll all the way down, we have one, which is the very end. You can see play stop is turned off for voice 1, and it's turned off for everything else. So, and you can also see sort of like you have different transformation functions here that it's supplying values for. The values that it's getting a little more nitty gritty, but the values that it's supplying aren't going straight into the transformation function. So it's not telling it like transpose a certain amount. What it's telling it is it's each transformation function has an accompanying phrase generator that, based on that subjective variable that I mentioned called improvisational flux, which is this number from 0 to 1 that describes how chaotic it's going to be. Based on that number, the phrase generator is going to generate the values for the transformation function. So you can see here the flux is set to 1, which means super chaotic. And this is the mode of transposition, etc. This is a syntax thing. When the flux is set to something other than 0 and the manual values are specified, all that means is that the manual value provides a maximum limit for the transposition. So it's transposing up to a majored sixth in up or down a lot in different ways. So in that sense, what we're specifying is several levels of abstraction away from the notes themselves. And theoretically, you could create a new layer of abstraction that could algorithmically generate one of these improvisational schemes, which might be a really cool thing to try to do and see what happens. But that's sort of, I don't know, that's sort of how it works vis-a-vis how specific the schemes are compared to the music. What I'll also show you is an Excel file that I used to compose this one, because it's really difficult to compose music in this, if at all possible. One of the biggest challenges is that if I want to do something at the end of the song, to learn what it sounds like, I need to play through the whole beginning of the song first, because it's generating everything in real time. I can't just skip to the end. So this making a spreadsheet really helped me in terms of like, okay, you know, what changes when. Also, like, say, for example, I want to change this rhythm here. This is a rhythm. Let me go down. That's a rhythm. If I want to change that rhythm, I have to change that rhythm for every breakpoint that comes after it, because it won't cascade down. So things like that are kind of challenging, but using a spreadsheet is sort of what helped me navigate all that. So if that offers any insight into the process.
So more or less, it's unique. The piece is unique every single time.
Yeah, from on a granular, like if I played it for you, it would sound very similar to what we just heard, but the
But
notes
it's
and
unique.
rhythms are unique. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Anything else? Yeah.
Local sense musically. So if you turn up
Mhm.
to like flux to 1,
Mhm.
does it always based on the current context, it generates something that makes local sense, at least on this phrase?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, it depends what you mean by sense. It might make something that doesn't sound like it belongs in the song, but it'll, yeah, I mean, like you can turn them all up to, you can turn them all on, and you'll get sound out of it. You'll get music out of it, but it'll just sound so random as to be unmusical. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Anything else? I think do we have snacks outside or something like that? Okay, we have snacks. Why don't we, and is there hold on, any questions from anyone watching at home? I ignored our Zoom folks, so I don't see any. And you can all unmute yourselves if you want to. So, okay, cool. In that case, I think maybe we can end and we can just talk. I mean, I'll be around. I'll eat some of that Jimmy John's or whatever we have. So great. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a blast. Thanks. Thanks so much.